Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for the Northwestern Indiana Regional Planning Commission, also known as NERPC, Freight Planning in Northwest Indiana webinar. My name is Stephanie Smith, and I am with South Shore Clean Cities. South Shore Clean Cities is a nonprofit organization that promotes the use of alternative fuels and clean vehicle technologies. We also manage the Northwestern Indiana Green Fleet program for our local metropolitan planning organization, NERPC. The goal of this program is to significantly improve the environmental performance of business and government fleets across the region in Lake Porter and LaPorte counties through diesel retrofits and other strategies. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website after the webinar at southshorecleancities.org. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type it in the question box and we'll get to those at the end. Now I would like to introduce Jack Eskin, who is the Regional Planner for Freight at NERPC. Jack, whenever you're ready, you can take it over. You might have yourself muted, Jack. I don't think we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
You are good to go.
All right, great. Well, apologies for that, everyone. My name is Jack Eskin. I'm a regional planner here at NERPC. I wear many different hats, one of them being freight planning, along with environmental planning, land use planning. Thank you all for joining us this morning. I am going to take you through a number of different topics. First, I'm going to explain what freight is. It may seem like a simple question, but you know, it's something that a lot of people don't deal with on a daily basis, so it's worth discussing in addition to what is freight planning. I'm going to talk about the trends and issues happening in freight planning right now, a lot of the major projects happening in Northwest Indiana, what many of the opportunities and challenges are in freight planning, and then I'm going to go into greater depth on the work that NERPC is doing in this area. So what is freight? Simple, straightforward question. It's the commercial shipment of cargo through various modes of transportation. There are ones that we think of as being traditional modes of shipping freight, like trucks, rail, boats, and airplanes, but this really can be expanded and increasingly is being expanded to different areas where, you know, it's just another mode of transporting goods, like pipelines, utility lines, and increasingly broadband, which is a big topic. What is freight planning? And before you answer that question, you need to take a step back and ask, why is a public sector agency dealing with something like freight planning? Because freight is, of course, shipped by private companies. You know, you've got folks like UPS, FedEx shipping things by air, and all these different companies like Canadian National, Norfolk Southern shipping things by rail. What is the entry point for a public sector agency to engage in private market activity? And it's really about establishing a collaborative effort between the public sector, the private sector, communities, and advocacy groups to sort of address a lot of the shared problems. One big one is the safety and efficiency of our roadways and railroads, managing and improving that, integrating freight priorities into our ongoing planning process as well as that of the communities in our area, minimizing congestion and hazards associated with freight on communities and the environment, promoting economic development opportunities, and just tying it all together between freight, land use, environment, making it part of the comprehensive planning process. And why do we need to do this? There are a lot of issues happening in freight right now. As many of you have experienced in Northwest Indiana and in different parts of the country, there's an overall increase in freight shipments right now. Americans consume a lot of foreign goods and a lot of goods in general, and we also produce a lot of garbage, and all of that needs to be shipped. And so increasingly you're seeing more and more containers moving through the country, moving through communities, moving through our highway systems, moving through our railroads. Another big item to point out is, we are all reading about the domestic energy boom right now, particularly oil and gas fracking. That has meant more and more tank cars coming from Canada and North Dakota and the West out to eastern refineries. So specifically in Northwest Indiana, if you've been seeing more tank cars, it's not just a mirage. It's that we're drilling and it's being shipped to refineries increasingly, and this is an impact of the domestic energy boom. So the overall system in which this is happening is the American intermodal system. And think of the railroads and the highways that move through the United States as sort of a gateway or one leg of the global shipping network. This competes with a variety of different pathways, one of them being the Panama Canal. To give an example, you've got goods coming from Asia being shipped to West Coast ports like Long Beach and Los Angeles and Seattle. And to reach East Coast markets like New York and DC and Boston, they need to either go through the American intermodal system through its railroads, through its highways, and reach the East Coast markets that way, or it can choose just to bypass the West Coast and go through the Panama Canal and up on ships to East Coast ports. One big thing is the Panama Canal is being widened right now, which means that they can accommodate bigger ships, which means that more and more freight can be shipped that way rather than through the American intermodal system. So what is going to be the impact that that will have on global shipping patterns and different regions of the United States that are dependent on freight for part of their economy? These are big global questions that localize themselves in specific regions like ours. An important thing to know about Northwest Indiana being part of the Chicago market is that Chicago is the hub of the American intermodal system, and this is really what drove Chicago from its origins. It is where East meets West in the United States. Eastern railroads meet Western railroads, meet Southern railroads, all in Chicago, the same with the interstate system, and of course Great Lakes ports. So what that means is all the roads and all the railroads heading eastward from Chicago go through Northwest Indiana, making it a very intensive area for freight arteries, which is why freight planning is so important and significant in Northwest Indiana. As you can imagine, Chicago has a lot of congestion, and the saying goes in the freight world that it takes 3 days to get from the Pacific Ocean to Chicago, 3 days to get through Chicago, and then 3 days to get to the Atlantic coast. And so because of that, both in the trucking industry and both in the rail industry, they're looking increasingly on ways to bypass the interurban area of the Chicago metro region, which is why you're seeing so many significant bypass projects happening here. The Ileana Expressway, all the work that's being done on US 30, and Canadian National's acquisition of the EJ&E Railroad. I'll talk about that later. These all serve as beltways bypassing Chicago, and as a result, this freight is moving faster than it would through interurban Chicago. But at the same time, for those who live in the suburbs and the outer regions of the metro region, you're seeing increased freight traffic in the suburbs, which has a lot of impacts. Just a quick note on some of these projects right now. The Ileana Expressway, it needs no introduction for many of you, but just a quick run through. It's a new 46-mile interstate highway running from Will County, Illinois, to South Lake County, Indiana. Hello? Okay, I just heard. I apologize. moving from Will County, Illinois to South Lake County, Indiana. It's slated originally for construction to begin in 2015. A lot of hurdles to go over before then. It would serve as a bypass for trucks moving from the Chicago metro region to avoid congestion. It would create stronger road connection to a lot of new intermodal facilities in South suburban Chicago, particularly in Will County, the largest one in the country. Of course, is in Elwood, Illinois, just outside Joliet. And you're seeing more and more intermodal development in the south suburbs, including the new South Suburban Airport that they're targeting. The Atlantic Expressway would be a real strong road connection to all that. Of course, there's a number of points of contention about this project, and it's for these reasons that it potentially could be slowed down with lawsuits, partially at least. But there's some questions over whether the distance is too far from a lot of the existing activity in the Chicago metro region, whether its toll structure is too steep. They're being sued by a number, or excuse me, the Illinois agencies trying to implement this are facing a lawsuit from different environmental groups about whether this highway would have a negative impact on a lot of the environmental assets in the region, particularly the Medeoin Prairie outside of Joliet. And of course, the project cost is somewhat of a point of contention. It is being shouldered by both public and private partners, but it's going to be a $1.5 billion roadway to construct. The Elgin, Joliet, and Eastern Railroad being acquired by Canadian National. This is another example of one of these big sort of bypass beltway projects happening in the Chicago metro region. You've got Canadian National, which is a Class 1 railroad, and just to define that for you all, Class 1 railroad is sort of the equivalent of a major chain in the United States for railroads. It's the Targets, it's the Best Buys, it's the Walmarts of railroads, and it purchased sort of a smaller regional short line railroad, which would be more equivalent to like a Strachan Van Til's. I know I mixed metaphors there, but it bought this short line railroad as a way to bypass Chicago, because it sort of starts in Elgin and sort of serves as this beltway around the dense urban part of the city and connects with Lake Michigan in Gary. It serves as an opportunity for Canadian National to route intercontinental trains coming from British Columbia away from downtown Chicago en route to, say, New Orleans or Montreal or Toronto. But what this means is higher volumes of trains moving through town centers in the metro region in northwest Indiana, South County, and Will County. And Canadian National has spent a lot of time over the last few years coming up with agreements with different municipalities. In Griffith, they were able to accommodate for more trains by helping pay for gates in downtown Griffith, as well as instituting a quiet zone there so you didn't have train horns going off all the time. It also brings economic development opportunities, which is the other side of the coin. As part of this project, Canadian National made Kirk Yard in Gary their main classification yard, which a classification yard is really where containers get switched from one train to another as they're being shipped from one direction into a new direction. It's kind of like a hub. It's a cargo hub. And Gary now has the main cargo hub in the Midwest for Canadian National. It represented a $141 million investment. The RDA was involved in that and created over 100 jobs. So this sort of highlights the different challenges and opportunities with region-specific examples that you have in freight planning. On the one end, you want to balance quality of life with increased freight activity. Making sure that congestion is not affecting air quality, safety, environment, your transit systems, and of course community walkability. So what are the ways in which you can sort of address that? A number of different measures, overall planning, of course, development agreements, quiet zones, separating bridges from railroads, using bridges to separate roads from railroads or roads from other roads, and identifying designated shipping routes to keep major trucks from going through neighborhood streets. The opportunities, of course, are leveraging the existing infrastructure to spur economic development in vacant areas, and this is particularly applicable to Northwest Indiana, being of an industrial heritage, having a lot of vacant land in communities like Gary, but a significant amount of infrastructure. So that's the end where all this freight activity can be an opportunity. So this enters in NERPC into the equation. How do we address these freight challenges and opportunities? We collect, manage, and analyze freight data sets. We set regional freight performance measures as required by the federal government. We convene different stakeholder meetings for different projects. We have informed policy discussions. And we've done this through a lot of different reports. There's a freight chapter in our 2040 Comprehensive Regional Plan. We have an at-grade crossing study we've been working on for a good deal of time, sort of targeting the most problematic at-grade crossings in the region. We've got a freight and logistics study lined up looking at a lot of the economic opportunities and existing conditions for freight in the region. And we, of course, addressed the Ileana through a white paper we wrote, and freight was one of the areas we looked at. So first, let's look at the freight recommendations from our 2040 Comprehensive Regional Plan. They've focused on 6 different areas. Corridor planning and cargo-oriented development. I'll define all of these slide by slide. Highway, rail, grade crossings, multimodal, intermodal development, freight supportive land use planning and zoning, the extra heavy-duty truck route, US 12 and 20, and spurring a modal shift from truck to rail and maritime. So, cargo-oriented development and corridor planning. What is this? It's prioritizing land along existing rail and truck routes for freight-related development. Once again, particularly applicable in Northwest Indiana, where you've got lots of major roads, you've got ports, you've got railroads, but you also have a lot of vacant sites left over from industry that once existed in these communities. It's really about finding opportunities to reactivate, redevelop, remediate brownfield sites and vacant land in these communities for economic use and sort of get them back onto the grid because you already have the infrastructure there. This has been coined by the Center for Neighborhood Technology in Chicago as cargo-oriented development, and they've applied this model in different areas in south suburbs of Chicago, Blue Island being a particularly good example. Highway, railroad, at-grade crossings, a way in which a lot of people immediately sort of experience the impacts of freight. The plan cites reducing congestion and increasing safety at these crossings, and just managing an overall process of prioritizing the most problematic ones for grade separation, meaning the ones that it's the highest priority to build flyover bridges or tunnels to separate road traffic from having to cross through these railroads. And maintaining a corridor approach, understanding, especially with the potential for high-speed rail in this region, that you're going to get grade crossing after grade crossing along a lot of these heavily trafficked railroads, and so it doesn't make any sense to just focus on one when you've got 50 problematic ones, especially on high-volume train lines. And so finding ways in which to enhance certain corridors by targeting grade crossings on those particular corridors. Multimodal and intermodal development. Let me take a step back and define both. Multimodal means the capability of servicing different types of transportation, rail, truck, port, all those sorts of things, air. Intermodal means being able to transfer between one and the other. The policy recommendations are to increase the amount of these facilities to maximize the efficiency of each mode. A great way to think of this is transloading facilities, which involve transferring goods from rail to truck, from truck to air, from air to boat, finding these inter-mode connections that really allow for goods to move more efficiently rather than having a scenario where you've got trucks hauling goods from one end to the other, which have a lot of impacts on congestion, on air quality, whatnot. The more sort of intermode activity you get, the more efficiency and directness you get in freight shipping, and it also just ends up being more sustainable because, of course, if you've got a lot of containers coming from different trucks and being streamlined onto this one train that's going to this one area, that's going to mean less emissions, that's going to mean less traffic on the roads, more safety, all good things. This is increasingly being seen as an asset in the freight private sector market, and that market is growing. It's coined as transportation, distribution, and logistics, and sort of having this infrastructure means you can capitalize on more of that activity in the region. There are a lot of opportunities of existing infrastructure where this sort of capability could be applied. Within Northwest Indiana, the Gary Airport is certainly at the top of that list. Also the Porter County Airport, Kingsbury, the intermodal facility developing there is showing a lot of promise, not only from the rail standpoint, but also connecting to different highways and connecting national railroads with more local ones. The Port of Indiana, a significant asset, and Gibson Yard in Hammond. Freight supportive land use and zoning, and what this really hones in on is the idea of allowing for this freight growth and ongoing freight operations to exist while not negatively impacting communities. You can do this as a planner through a lot of devices that establish good neighbor practices between freight facilities and commercial and residential development, buffer zones, open space requirements, different types of low-impact design, context-sensitive lighting, green building techniques. A lot of these different measures sort of mitigate the impact of freight being around communities. The extra heavy-duty truck route, and this is sort of a specific issue to Northwest Indiana, but you've got US 12 and 20, which serves as an industrial highway connecting major industrial centers in the Midwest. In Indiana, it specifically runs from Hammond to South Bend, but ultimately it connects manufacturing in Illinois and Michigan with steel facilities and other industrial production happening in Northwest Indiana. Another way to look at it or describe it is you're connecting Indiana steel to and Indiana coal to Illinois and Michigan auto manufacturing. And so the federal government really sort of has highlighted US 12 and 20 as an important corridor for maintaining that commerce. An important thing to note is INDOT has relinquished a lot of the ownership of the road to communities along the road, and so the onus increasingly is on cities in Northwest Indiana, not the state, to upkeep that road. And you know, the more problems that road experiences in terms of potholes, in terms of traffic, in terms of snow conditions in the winter, the quality of the surface. That affects an important part of commerce in the Midwest. And so that's a very important asset to maintain. And lastly, supporting a modal shift to rail and maritime shipping where possible from trucks. And now, you're not going to get trucks and planes to transfer some of their goods to boats. Of course, if you're shipping a high priority package on FedEx by air, you're not wanting to see that be transferred to a boat where it's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to arrive where you want it to. But there's a lot of goods in the United States, like we were talking about in the intermodal and multimodal system, that are shipped by truck that, if made more attractive through policies or whatnot, could be shipped by rail and maritime. This would reduce truck volumes on the roads, and it would be better from an environmental standpoint, reducing emissions and congestion. And in Northwest Indiana, that infrastructure exists to make that possible. You've got a tremendous port, and you've got all these railroads running through the region. And so opportunities for shipping goods from trucks to rail and maritime where possible should be explored. So when the Indiana Expressway came to NERPC's Executive Board and full commission for a vote in support of it, we, as a staff at NERPC, compared the impact potentially, as we forecasted them, of the Indiana Expressway to what the policies were in our 2040 plan. This ran the gamut from transit to environment, and of course freight was part of that. The Indiana Expressway connecting major intermodal facilities in Illinois to a highway system in Northwest Indiana, of course. A big part of arguing for this project was trucking and freight. And so this was seen as a very important metric to put the project through, how it stood up against our freight policies, because a lot of the reason why this road was being built was to serve as a much-needed trucking corridor. And so we put it through the gamut, and we basically found it had mixed compatibility with what these policies were. From the corridor planning and cargo-oriented development approach, the Indiana did not really match it, because it was all about developing a new piece of infrastructure and a new highway in an area where you didn't have existing sites to spur economic development. And so it sort of missed the point of filling in, using existing infrastructure to fill in existing sites with new activity. Highway rail grade crossings, we found that the impacts were really uncertain. It was certainly going to take trucks away from a lot of the grade crossings in the northern part of Northwest Indiana, but there are a lot of grade crossings in the southern part of Northwest Indiana. We didn't really know whether trucks en route to the Indiana would be causing more and more problems on grade crossings. Multimodal and intermodal development, it's sort of a mixed bag. On the one hand, you're creating a new road that connects with major intermodal facilities, but on the other hand, you're creating a new road, which means more opportunities for trucks to drive further, which is sort of not entirely compliant with what we're supporting in terms of the mode shift that's desirable in intermodalism. Freight supportive land use planning and zoning, we found it was somewhat uncertain, because it's all about how the communities implement their codes around that highway and how the state participates in that. You know, if the communities put forth a lot of these best practices, then it's a good thing. If not, then it's a missed opportunity. It didn't really have much to do with the extra heavy-duty truck route, because those shipments going from steel facilities in Michigan and Illinois are so rooted so far north that it didn't really have much interaction with the Indiana. and ultimately we found that it was inconsistent with a desired shift to rail and maritime shipping, because you're really improving and enhancing trucking as a mode through this project. So as with many things, it wasn't entirely a clear picture. Let me also say, if anyone has any questions, obviously we'll answer them all in the end, but if there's anything that's a burning question in the middle of this presentation, I have no problem sort of stopping and addressing that. Moving forward, our at-grade crossing study. This has been something NERPSI has been working on since 2010. We've partnered with a number of different organizations, one of them being Purdue Calumet, on creating a regional inventory and feasibility study of the worst railroad highway at-grade crossings in Northwest Indiana. It's meant to serve as an established resource for potential at-grade crossing projects in the region. We've been putting together a study that profiles different crossings, profiles different structures, creates data metrics. We created sort of a calculator for what it would cost to build bridges over railroads, discuss the different financing opportunities, both public and private. We profiled the top 15 crossings that were identified as the most problematic in the region, and we delivered general findings and general recommendations. Sort of a quick boilerplate example of the things you find in this study. We're looking at a number of different crossings. One of them is this crossing on Calumet Avenue in Hammond, which crosses both CSX and the NICD tracks. We collect data on average delay per motorist, average amount of time that the gates are down, the number of vehicles that are delayed on that road, the percent of daily traffic that are delayed vehicles as a result of that crossing, and the percent chance that there's an accident at that crossing. And we give sort of like a baseline assessment of what should happen at that crossing, given all the right factors. This particular crossing we saw as a pretty high demand one for grade separation because of all the heavy auto traffic, commuter trains, and intermodal trains. And it is also a potential corridor for high-speed rail. We created sort of a mock schematic, very, very basic, certainly nothing on the level that an engineer would create, but the length of the bridge that would be required, and giving you an idea of the businesses that it would impact. In addition to the cost, this particular bridge, based on sort of the back of the napkin calculation, would likely be just under $20 million. Another example, and this project is actually moving forward, is Calumet Avenue in Munster, right at 45th Street. It crosses both a railroad that is served by CN and CSX. It's part of a larger redevelopment. Munster's really looking at creating a new downtown center in that area. And so the project involves creating two railroad bridges over the road, as opposed to a road bridge over the railroad, which is the more common design. And as you can see, we've got the same metrics that we did for the crossing in Hammond. This is a quick schematic that Robinson Engineering has put together for that crossing in Munster. As you can see, it's very expensive, but at the same time, this is an example where if there is a lot of community support behind this vision, it is something that can happen, of course. And there are a lot of examples of these sorts of things happening all over the country. One more example, on the Chesterton-Porter border, you've got an area known as Porter Junction that has 3 different railroads and potential high-speed rail line running through this particular crossing, different data metrics for these different railroads, and talking about what would need to happen for you to build a grade separated bridge. It's a complicated area structurally. You need to clear some houses. These are the sorts of things that aren't really being recommended in this study. It's more just how feasible is it to develop a piece of infrastructure like that. But if there's one thing that's clear, there's a tremendous amount of need to resolve the amount of train traffic and the amount of car traffic that queues up in this area and the safety concerns. In addition, we've got a freight and logistics study that we're teeing up that is based on a 2010 study we undertook. We're going to collect, analyze, and explain data on freight companies and freight employment in Northwest Indiana, explore a lot of the existing and developing supply chains and clusters, build a better link between a lot of this material that's being developed in different areas of Chicago and Indiana, and use this as sort of a resource to help inform public policy makers and private companies in communities and the decisions they're making regarding freight and economic development and transportation. So that's my presentation. Moving forward, I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of you have regarding freight. I, of course, am always here to answer questions here at NERC. So, yeah.
I have a question, Jack. In regards to the examples that you've shown everyone, what is your experience or anything that you've worked on with that construction with the train bridge or the bridge that's going to be built in Dyer? That's with the Linwood border and the Dyer border, or were you guys involved with that?
We weren't directly involved with that. It's interesting, the person who had my job before me is now directly involved with that, being at the South Suburban Mayors and Managers Association. We attended that event. We, of course, very much support it. But my understanding is the majority of that project is in Illinois. And so it doesn't really come through our budget in terms of a project to be funded. But we certainly support it from a policy standpoint. And we are following it in terms of seeing how it's being successful and how you can make that sort of model successful in Northwest Indiana.
No, great. That was just one thing because I live in the area, so I was just curious how that all was going and if you guys were working on it or anything.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions for Jack? We have the question box on your screen. And also, as you can see, his information is there on the screen, so you can contact him with any other questions you have after the presentation. So I'll give it another couple of seconds if anybody has anything. Okay. Well, again, this was being a recorded webinar and will be available on our website, southshorecleancities.org. And everybody will receive a copy of that and the slides after tomorrow after the presentation is completed, once it's done uploading. So thank you so much, Jack, and we greatly appreciate it. And any closing thoughts?
I would just say stay engaged. I think that freight planning is a new thing, relatively speaking, to a lot of communities. Understanding that this is, even though these are private developments, these are things that you as a community have a say about how it unfolds, and just sort of keep attuned to a lot of these global patterns that are happening, because it can affect your community in a positive or a negative way. But there are opportunities and there are plenty of impacts. So yeah, I would say just stay informed.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and hope everybody has a great week. Thanks, Jack.
Thanks.